Thank you and good morning, everyone. It's always a pleasure to speak at ABARES. It's always nerve-wracking when I look out into the audience and see some of Australia's largest cattle producers, cattle feedlotters, cattle processors, exporters, food service, retailers, and importantly their financiers in the audience. So let me start with the disclaimer. If what those people have told their financiers is different to what I present here now, I am wrong, they are right. And I apologise for any confusion that might have caused. Look, over the next 15 minutes, I just want to give you a quick snapshot of what we see as the outlook for emerging markets for Australian beef. I guess my key message for those who want to switch off for a little bit is the fact that the fundamentals for demand globally look really positive. This demand growth will be driven by emerging markets, where the combination of both population growth and income growth is most powerful and going to be felt upon the drivers of demand. So let me start at the basics. And those basics are the fact that there's two key factors which drive demand for beef. It's the number of mouths that need feeding, or the population, and the ability to feed those mouths, or GDP. And as we look across the globe, we see both of these being incredibly positive, leading to an optimistic and positive outlook for beef demand. When we look at the population growth, and we look at the United Nations forecast for absolute growth in populations in our key marketplaces, we see the vast majority of population growth is going to be occurring, unsurprisingly, in emerging marketplaces, but predominantly in Asia. Between now and 2015, and when I say now, this was from 2011 to 2015, UN forecasts were that China would add an additional 28 million people, so adding more than the Australian population over a period of 5 years. Southeast Asia, 32 million, Indonesia, 12 million, Middle East and North Africa countries, nearly 39 million. Now, all of these are important, growing and emerging markets for us. When we combine these population growth figures with the FAO forecasts of meat consumption, given the fact that there's such varying cultures, traditions and availability of protein in the marketplace, we're able to get an estimate of potential growth for demand in each of these markets based off these population growths. When we do that, we actually find that the 4% population growth in the US, 4% on the 300 million plus in the United States, which gives rise to an additional 13 million Americans. When you combine that with their per capita consumption of around 41 kilograms in 2011 per person, when you compare that figure, end result, against the figures that you generate out of the rapid population growth we're going to see across Asia, but which only has between 2 and 4 kilograms per capita consumption, and Middle East and North Africa, which has around 7 kilograms per capita consumption. When we look purely at population growth, that 4% above the United States provides the single biggest driver in terms of increasing demand over this next 5-year period. When we turn, however, to the story on income growth, we know from historical data that as incomes rise, demand for beef rises. Now, in developed countries such as the US, Japan, Australia, increase in expenditure normally translates into increase in eating out from home, into shifting to higher value beef cuts and meals, rather than necessarily increased consumption. However, when we look to these emerging markets, increase in expenditure on beef translates almost directly into increased consumption. So if beef prices are assumed to remain unchanged, and we all know that that won't be the case, the great equilibrium between supply and demand is price. But assuming the beef prices remain unchanged, we can calculate the percentage growth in expenditure on beef and forecast potential increase in beef consumption due to income growth across these emerging marketplaces. When we do that, we find that the potential growth in beef consumption globally due to income across the globe is around 2.8 million tonnes carcass weight. Now, it's double the result we get from running those figures on purely population, indicating that the increase in GDP or the increase in the world's prosperity is the single largest driver of beef consumption across the globe, and more than twice of that of the increasing population driver. And it's this driver in which the emerging markets also dominate. I mean, China shows the largest potential growth. I think 42% of the total of the forecast, that extra 2.8 million tonnes required, is captured by the growth in prosperity in China. And it reflects that fast forecast GDP that we see for that marketplace. But before you can put together these drivers of population and GDP, it's important to have a look at what the emerging markets also have a role to play on the supply side of the equation. And I want to briefly touch on that. Again, bring it back to the basics. There's two key drivers for beef supply: the number of cattle and the amount of meat or the amount of beef on each of those animals. Now, when we look across the globe, we see that over the past decade, there's been a tremendous growth in cattle herds across emerging markets. However, in the more mature, more traditional beef market, beef suppliers, it's been a stagnation, slight increases in some and a backward movement in some others. Significant increases in the emerging market herds, however, for example, Brazil and India, which during the period between 2000 and 2012, I mean, those two countries alone added 23 million head to the global herd, with Brazil increasing its herd over that period by 31%, and India increasing its herd by 21% to 63 million head. So those herd increases, which have primarily been in these emerging marketplaces, have played an important role in changing the shape of beef exports and the competition we face as exporters around the globe. Now, while there are doubts about the ability for this type of herd increase to continue at this pace, there's little doubt that there's plenty of upside in that secondary driver of the amount of meat, the amount of beef on each of these carcasses. In fact, if you have a look at the average weights of cattle slaughtered in 2011 across the globe, you can see the average weights in these emerging markets, which have up till now primarily been focused on building their herd numbers, has got tremendous upside. A focus on improved genetics, improved seasons and feed availability could all provide a significant driver for increased beef production out of these emerging markets across the globe. When you put the story of the past, is that blurry for everyone? Just me. When you put together the story of the supply and demand over emerging markets back since 2000, you can see that major increases in beef production in Pakistan, India, China, Brazil have really led the global herd growth. Now, in the case of China and Pakistan, that increase in production has been utilised within their own domestic marketplace to offset the rapid growth in domestic demand that they've seen. In the case of Brazil and India, equally, a lion's share of that production growth has gone to meeting the needs of increasing domestic requirements, but they've had sufficient surplus to really stamp their voice and their authority in the international marketplace and to really intensify competition in a number of the emerging markets where Australia has now been, and Australian exporters have been endeavouring to get footholds.